Alec MacGillis. Welcome to the Realignment.
Well, thanks for having me.
Good to see you, Alec.
You too.
Alec, this is one of the episodes where I am very happy that I actually read the book, because there's a world where this was a book that was literally just about Amazon. So we would have gone into the conversation. I would have quizzed you like you were Brad Stone, and you would have had to awkwardly point out that actually this is about more of an Amazon. It's about the country. It's about what Amazon is telling us about the country and the way things are going. So let's just start there with a personal question. Sagar and I are millennials. During the 2000s, when we were becoming of political age, a lot of these conversations around these topics were focused on Walmart. So, and I think if you'd written this book back then, it would have been focused on Walmart. So what has really happened in our discourse that has made Amazon the best company or broader thing to focus on during this moment?
A couple things. I think, for starters, there's the problem that I set out to write about in the book, about regional inequality, the growing gaps between places in America, has simply gotten a lot worse since we are talking about Walmart. I mean, back in Walmart is obviously a huge problem of its own and has caused all sorts of devastation around the country. But it was a different sort of had a different sort of regional geographic effect than what we're seeing with Amazon and the other tech giants. With Walmart, it was the really kind of the hollowing out of the downtown, the main street, the local businesses, in that, happening in the 70s, 80s, 90s. What has happened since, and that was very much kind of tied to the kind of the decline of the American small town in a way, and that's a huge problem. And one chapter of the book is really kind of focused on rural decline and rural isolation, in which Walmart played such a big role. But what's happened more recently in the last couple of decades, since we were sort of focused on Walmart, is this other sort of geographic effect, which is this growing gap between a set of sort of winner-take-all cities, and left behind cities and towns, small towns, but also good-sized cities that really have been left behind in the new kind of tech economy, and in Amazon and the other tech giants are much more important in that story than Walmart, and because of the way that they have just come to dominate whole sectors of the economy, and thereby through that concentration of whole sectors of the economy, have created a sort of regional concentration where more and more wealth and prosperity in the country is sort of sucked or hoovered into the places where these companies reside.
Yeah, I think one of the most fascinating parts of the book to me is that you tell it in vignettes. So it's not like a 20 or 50,000 foot view. It's very much actually like a 5-foot view of this is what it is like from the perspective of this person and how Amazon affected their life. Or more importantly, I think actually how their life was affected by these, kind of multifaceted trends. Could you go into, this is frankly the part I found most fascinating, is about reassigning economic value to different middle American towns and more, and the structures of their economies where they used to be in transition through Walmartization, and now in kind of the final, I wouldn't call it the end state, but like their latest state of being, the Amazon center or an Amazon services center.
Yeah, I mean, this is what we're seeing all around the country, and I chose a couple places to focus on. At one point I thought about having a whole bunch of different places, where you're constantly moving from one place to another, and it's where I would have added in maybe a couple other winter cities like San Francisco or New York, or Boston, or added in some more sort of warehouse places like the Inland Empire of Southern California, which is kind of warehouse ground zero. But I wanted to make it sort of hold together as a narrative and not be spread too thin. And so I ended up with really a small handful of places to focus on. And the main kind of like left behind cities that I chose to focus on were in Ohio and then Baltimore, where I live, and what you see in both those places is just that kind of shift that you just described, where you have a place like Dayton, Ohio, that truly was in its day kind of the Silicon Valley of its time, with just incredible innovations coming out of there, not just the Wright brothers, but all sorts of just really major.
The cash register, that was my favorite one.
Cash register, and then major automotive engineering innovations. So Dayton, in like the 1890s, has more patents per capita than anywhere in the country, and really just this font of innovation and ingenuity, and then it kind of matures into a major manufacturing center, the biggest automotive city in the country after Detroit. Just tons of assembly plants, but also more importantly, auto parts plants in the Dayton area, but then just gets crushed in the first decade of the century. There had definitely been some decline before then. White flight, the usual story of depopulation, all that, flight to the suburbs, but the city didn't truly get crushed until the first decade of the century, following NAFTA, but more importantly, China being allowed into the WTO, which had such a disproportionate effect in certain manufacturing-heavy communities like the Dayton area. So just incredible levels of job loss and population loss that come in the Bush years and then in the Great Recession, and so to the point where the city like this is now essentially become a logistics town. One thing the city still has going for it is that it's well located at the juncture of two major interstates, and 70 and 75, and it as people, it's almost become like something people boast about, like, oh, we're closer to the rest of the country than anywhere else in the country, that kind of thing. You can get to anywhere in a day, sort of, from here. And
that you actually want to get to is the
exactly
part.
Yeah, that's the part that's left out, sort of.
Like, you don't want to be in Dayton, but you definitely want to be in Chicago.
Right. We'll get to, yeah, exactly. Well, we're just a hop, skip, and a jump, and so the city is now just has all sorts of, it's just a real sort of center of trucking and packaging and shipping, and then the one industry that I focus on in this chapter, cardboard boxes. There's a big sort of cardboard, or as they like they prefer to call it, corrugated.
I loved that part. They're professionals call it corrugated.
Right. Yeah. And so I focus on a young man who's just, it's a really kind of heartbreaking, poignant story of a young man whose father had a small business, trucking business, a fleet of about 8 or 10 trucks that took auto parts up and down I-75, that corridor up to Detroit, but he lost his business to bankruptcy in the Great Recession, and his son has just struggled his whole life through incredible succession of low-wage jobs. He's got a strong work ethic, but he's just never been able to make headway. And when I met him and his family, his girlfriend and their 3 young kids, they were living in a homeless shelter in Dayton, after sort of a string of of downward mobility. They landed in the shelter while he was still working at a cardboard company, making $10 or $11 an hour there, and so that he in the book kind of comes to embody the transformation of this one city from the one kind of work to the other kind of work.
Yeah. I think what's fascinating about this, and I was thinking about this during the entirety of the book, was how much of this was inevitable, because you named in your previous answer the decision to enter the NAFTA, the decision to allow China into the WTO, and then effectively not mind the shop afterwards. Those were public policy choices. At the same time, you have the fact that what the internet did is to a certain degree, it ruined a lot of the geographic monopolies that the newspapers you refer to. For example, now when you're a local newspaper, you have to compete with Facebook and Google, and that could have been a myriad of different businesses that you also had to implicitly compete with Craigslist as well too. So there are all these broader non-policy trends. So how do we separate the inevitable from the choices? Or, and I don't want to even say the outcome, but at least what challenges were caused by decisions that specific people made, and what challenges were basically going to happen the second that monopolies pre-internet went away.
I think it's a really, really good, important question. It's a deep one. I mean, I think I guess one way to think about it is that the internet happened, and it was going to have all these effects, all sorts of effects on the media and otherwise, but we didn't have to allow the giants to get as big as they did. I mean, that was the real choice. That's where the choice that lies at the heart of the book, is that we have allowed ourselves to get back to a kind of Gilded Age level of concentration, and in a way that as all sorts of very smart economists and other writers in the last couple of years have pointed out was not inevitable, and was the result of an actual decision, an actual shift in our politics over the last half century or so, to take a much more lax, kind of diffident approach to antitrust and monopoly. And so when I was talking to so that's one basic set of that was one set of decisions. That was one set of actual specific things you could point to that we as recently as the Obama administration, just a really striking laxness when it came to not doing anything about this handful of companies getting ever larger and ever more powerful. And one of the big questions now is whether Biden administration will take a different tack. The other set, though, of actual sort of things that we can point to, and I think, and sort of hold people accountable for, is on the corporate side. And when I spoke to Amazon for the book, I spoke to them at length. Their basic line was, "Look, if it's not us doing this, it would be someone else. Like, this is just." The world shifted online. Commerce has shifted to e-commerce. There was going to be someone like us that was going to be this dominant in this realm, and it just happens to be us. We happen to be called Amazon. I mean, I think there's something to that. Like, there are these big structural forces in our economy and in our society, and that have given rise to a certain way of doing business, but there are very specific things they chose to do as a company that allowed them to become even more dominant, or that allowed the effects of their dominance to be even more deleterious to the country. They didn't have to be as aggressive as they were in pursuing every possible tax avoidance gambit. They don't have to be as incredibly demanding in the way that they approach their workers and the productivity expectations in the warehouses. They could have put HQ2 somewhere in a part of the country that could have really used a boost, and that could have really, in some way, kind of broadened out prosperity in this country, instead of putting it in the absolute richest city in the country. There are all these different things that they chose to do that could have been where they could have chosen otherwise, and left us with a somewhat less imbalanced sort of dystopian reality. So I get a little frustrated when I think a lot of liberals these days have a tendency to, smart liberals have a tendency to really like to sort of talk about everything being in terms of structural and systemic forces, and sort of go to that level. And I, of course, you always have to keep those in mind. But I think we often there's a tendency to then to give short shrift to actual personal agency and personal choice and personal responsibility, and let people off the hook.
Yeah. It was fascinating in your answer there because that was going to be my follow up. Like, well, what specific, things did they do that exacerbated it? And because I do think there was an inevitablest part of this. And then there was also, like you said, the discrete choices that Amazon made. I think HQ2 is such a fascinating part of all of this. So first of all, for people who are listening and who don't know, could you explain the HQ2 kind of saga, the bidding war system of Amazon and relocating its headquarters, how they ultimately decided on Washington, D.C., and what that, or on Crystal City, excuse me, outside of Washington, D.C., and what that explains about the Amazonification in terms of the geographical impact of their wealth concentration?
So Amazon decided that it needed a second headquarters. It had gotten so big in Seattle that it was really kind of just outgrowing the place with, more and more, as the book describes, more and more just concerns about incredible congestion and housing affordability in Seattle, where there are now 45,000 people working for Amazon in the city, and it's just an astonishing growth there. So they decide they need to have a second headquarters somewhere else. They decide to turn it into this great sort of national sweepstakes, kind of a media spectacle of, kind of a bachelor show type reality show process where cities can, make bids for the second headquarters, and there'll be, then a great hullabaloo around the process and the winner. They get 238 bids from around the country, and cities just throwing themselves at Amazon's feet with just all these offers of billions of dollars and tax subsidies, tax incentives, just these really kind of painfully obsequious offers. One suburb of Atlanta offers to rename itself Amazon, and I mean, just this, it just really throwing themselves at the company's feet. But there's, meanwhile, amidst all this, this kind of grotesque spectacle, there is some kind of hope that the company is going to go somewhere that really needs it. That this in one fell swoop, that you could actually restore some kind of balance toward economic geography by having the company go to some left behind city or region of the country. So, just imagine if it chooses for a second headquarters a city like St. Louis, which, has just fallen so far from its prime. Population loss as large as Detroit's. Just these gorgeous city, one of my favorite cities in America, just so utterly underpopulated and just crying out for new investment, and right in the middle of the country. And then, but it becomes quickly clear that Amazon's not thinking in those terms. Its top 20 finalists for HQ2 do not include any of the cities that we would probably agree are on that list of cities that can most use the boost. So no St. Louis, no Detroit, no Cleveland, no Baltimore, no Milwaukee. I mean, on down the list. The few cities that were sort of middle American cities that did make the cut are the ones that are sort of like the regional winners of, so Columbus made it, Nashville made it. And then, comes time for the winners to be declared, and it's, lo and behold, it's the two all along most obvious candidates on the East Coast, the opposite coast from Seattle, DC and New York. And the New York selection kind of blows up because there's a backlash from the sort of the AOC New York progressive left over the very generous tax subsidies that New York dangled gave to Amazon. But so we're left then with just Arlington, Virginia, Crystal City. And it's just incredible to think about this. I mean, these 25,000 jobs, high-paid jobs, the billions in investment, capital investment for the new headquarters, going to the city that is metro area that is home to 5 or 6 of the wealthiest 10 counties in America. And the stated reason for this choice is a human capital rationale that
Right.
Washington is home to this the most highly educated workforce in the country. All these people that are already working in the sort of like tech contractor universe that is spread out around Washington, fueled heavily by Homeland Security and counterterrorism spending since 9/11. So you have all those kind of people there already. And so that's the reason that Amazon gives for wanting to go to Washington. It's just like that's where the people we need are. What is left unmentioned is that the other big reason for Amazon to go there is that Washington is the seat of the federal government, of power, and Amazon has now gotten to the point where it is so dominant that it really has more to fear from the federal government and possible intervention by the federal government than it does from other corporate rivals. And so it makes total sense to go to Washington to just build up its presence there, which is something it's actually been doing for some years now, even before it chose Washington for HQ2. Bezos bought the Washington Post. He bought this massive mansion in the city for $23 million in cash, which he's turning into a sort of salon. And the company's vastly increased its lobbying spending in the city to the point where it's basically the biggest lobbying spender in town. So it's just become a huge presence. It's also just getting tons of cloud contracts. A lot of the government cloud contracts, though narrowly, missed out on the big Pentagon one recently. So it has vastly increased its presence in Washington to a degree that I don't think anyone has reckoned with, and to a degree that's certainly not been reckoned with by the local newspaper, which would normally be, in the prime spot to tell that story of a corporate takeover of Washington, D.C., but is now in a somewhat awkward position to tell that particular story.
Yeah.
Speaking of awkward positions, you have this really useful line from an analytical perspective about the nature of the Democratic Party, in that a huge portion of the party's base are the persons of color, oftentimes who work in an Amazon warehouse. At the same time, the people who are most in love with Amazon, the people who've most gone into it, are the Whole Foods, Washington Post reading, Prime receivers, who are the upper middle class part. That's the Joe Biden coalition. That's what gives him the Democratic primary. At the same time, though, Tim Wu and Lena Khan are going to most likely serve in the Biden administration. So can you just, and you were saying this when you were talking about earlier about liberals, can you just talk about how all these tensions are playing out? Because it just seems there's all of these factors going into it, which are both on the one hand cynical, but on the other hand, if you're looking at Tim Wu and Lena Khan, I think to a certain degree should be optimistic.
Right. No, it's a fascinating dynamic that we have playing out now on the left. I mean, as you've said, that the core Amazon is universal now, but its core demographic is the middle class, upper middle class, big metro, blue metro area consumer. I mean, that's what the sort of market demographics show. Walmart is still stronger in sort of small town red America, but Amazon is strongest in the big blue metros. And that's why all these apartment buildings in New York are now just overrun with packages and struggling with how to even deal with them. This wave of packages that show up at these nice apartment buildings in the city, and they don't even know what to do with them. They pile up on the sidewalk and they flow outside the lockers in the lobby, and these doormen are just like, what do I do with these Amazon boxes? And my my line in the book, which was one of the last lines I actually added to the book after Biden's election last fall, was that the Democrats have become essentially the Amazon coalition. It's the people who buy this stuff in great quantities, the upper middle class liberal urban consumer who buys the stuff, and then the people who package and deliver it to them, who in these cities are heavily black and brown, and that's an awkward coalition to maintain, and that coalition, the awkwardness has grown this past year because of the incredible alacrity with which these consumers embraced Amazon and expanded their Amazon habit. It's just I've been kind of gobsmacked watching it, just how much sort of my world of I live in upper middle class neighborhood in Baltimore, and how much my world has embraced the one-click life, and the reliance on low paid, low wage, mostly Black and Hispanic workers to deliver these things, all these needs to them. And just
one quick follow-up on this, because speaking of the coalitions, one of the more forward-looking moves was the decision to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour, which, separate from whether or not that actually gets the job done for folks, that was very much let's say the Bernie AOC wing of things, or whatever we handle that. So you just really see this, I don't know, it's just fascinating. Just all these, the real point is that not only is Amazon a story of America, it's the story of the Democratic Party under Joe Biden, and really, and Jay Carney going on to become, man, it's, I'm saying it out loud, but that's the point here.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And so Amazon a couple years ago gave people a license to order from them and feel okay about it with the $15 an hour. And then this past year, the public health experts gave people even bigger license to start ordering, to go completely one click, with the stay home, bend the curve mantra. And so you didn't have to feel bad about it at all anymore. You were just doing what the experts said. You were flattening the curve. And so you saw this wholesale embrace of that whole, way of living, way of consuming. And really, and again, you saw it especially in blue places. And so on the one hand, you have this huge growth of the company, fueled by blue metro consumers, and then on the other hand, you have people within, people on the left, who have grown increasingly concerned about the dominance and have become increasingly incisive in their analysis of the problem, and now are in the few examples you mentioned of Lena Khan and Tim Wu being brought into the fold of by the Biden administration, and it is going to be so interesting to see how what is essentially a clash within the left, between a sort of broader, democratic realm, liberal realm that is essentially okay, very much
right.
Doesn't want to hear it. Like, really, just doesn't want to hear the problems with this, because they've grown ever more dependent on the company and its ilk, and then the sort of the critic, the small but influential critic cohort that is actually going to try to do something about this. And this is all happening within the left.
It's so funny because, when you really sit back and think, like, you have to admire Bezos just from like a chutzpah perspective, where you're like, the dude buys the Washington Post, before anybody is even really talking about tech and media. Resigns from the company when he's like the richest man in the world, enriched himself, or not resigned, steps down from the CEO position because he explicitly, I mean, I'm just speculating, didn't like getting dragged before Congress, doesn't want to be the public face. It's like Sundar Pichai, Larry Page, and Sergey Brin get to go like chase flying cars or whatever. Sundar has to go and appear before Congress. It's like in every single level, increasing the $15 minimum wage. And at the same time, being virulently anti-union. It's like placating and playing off both sides of the left and making sure that he's always got hold on institutional power. I do want to pick up on something you said about one-click America and lockdowns giving permission to people in order to not feel bad about ordering from Amazon. I'm just curious what you mean by that. And because, I mean, obviously it's not a secret. And some of the more conspiratorial stuff that I have seen is, like the lockdowns were really a ploy. I mean, Amazon's market cap has gone up by like, I don't even know how much. I think Bezos, you were telling me this morning, he made like 58 billion just this year. So yeah, go into that about the lockdowns, their specific impact both on Amazon, its balance sheet, exacerbating inequality in your view, and just more.
Oh, it's just been, I mean, I had no idea when I started this book. I started this book 3 years ago was when I officially kind of launched the work on the book, and had no idea, of course, that the problems, the landscape that it was describing would just be intensified so much by the time I was actually publishing it. I mean, the numbers are, I don't think we've grappled at all with just how huge the expansion of this company has been in the last year. And I think we haven't grappled with it partly because we all feel kind of implicated in it. I mean, 40% increase in sales year over year, over already, of course, starting from a very large base already. I mean, the company's grown so much in the last few years, but then you got 40% increase in sales over that. 500,000 more people hired, and not including the drivers who are all quote independent contractors, even though they all drive Amazon vans and wear Amazon jerseys. There's such a massive need for additional workforce given the increase in sales. 50% additional warehouse space in just a year. And they were already everywhere, and now 50% more on top of that. The market stock up 86% or so, year over year. But it's also something you just feel viscerally. You don't even need the numbers in a way. Like, I was driving up to one of my younger son's baseball game just last Friday, just 20 miles north of Baltimore here. And it got really, really eerie how many trucks I saw just on that like sort of 20-mile stretch of I-95 going north of Baltimore. It was stunning. It was just, I describe a scene like that in the book from a year ago, but this was actually worse. Like it was even more chilling just how many trucks you saw. You see it, you go jogging around on recycling day. Oh my God, the box, like it's just,
yeah.
Or just here on my block, again and again, as I was doing the book, there'd be these moments where, like, as I clicked to send the book into my publisher, like a van pulled up at that very moment. It's constant. And so there has been this embrace of this way of consuming and this way of living that I, to a degree that I have found kind of shocking. And to a degree, let me say, to a degree that is actually, I would wager, is in excess of the public health recommendations. I mean, it has continued, throughout. It has gotten bigger and bigger. It has continued even as, even last summer when, the numbers got much better and lower in a lot of places. It has just, and even to now when we're seeing, thankfully, numbers getting much better in a lot of places, it's just continued. And I would say it goes beyond what was strictly necessary for what the epidemiologists were urging us.
The thing which is difficult here is I'm trying to balance two competing instincts. One is the one where you viscerally describe the serious impacts of Amazon's growth, hyper growth, not just growth in terms of a business, but really specific strategy of growth, the very libertarian, like sort of center left neoliberal approach to these questions when it comes to responsibility to communities. But at the same time, especially during COVID, when things are finishing up, it's hard for me. I'm not accusing you of like minimizing like the serious human costs. I just have a harder time getting fired up about Amazon expansion like during this year. Is more what I'm saying. And I feel as if there are definitely going to be people in the audience who are very much of that. And honestly, like I'm of that variety. The Whole Foods using Amazon Prime, where it's like, look, we didn't feel safe. We were wiping down our groceries back in March, and actually the Whole Foods in Logan Circle, we live in DC, that was actually clean, and I actually trusted it, and it was actually a thing. It was packed. So how do we balance these two things? Because it feels as if the 1 year of the pandemic just really is this weird part of history where we didn't know what was going to happen. So can you just speak to that? It almost seems as if you're suggesting that what's worse than the pandemic is the fact that after the pandemic, Amazon will be much bigger than it was. And it's hard for me to agree emotionally with that reaction.
Nothing was worse than the pandemic. There's just no question of that. I think a lot will ride on what happens now, and what we see, if we see how these habits continue, and if we see basically whether people are willing to re-engage with the physical world around them. I mean, I think what I've just been struck by is the level of how extreme the level of withdrawal has been from your local community, from your local businesses, just the willingness to really kind of just pull back and batten down the hatches and let people bring stuff to you. People making a lot less than you who have to go back to crowded houses with housing with multi-generational families, and they're the ones who are out there exposing themselves in all sorts of ways while you're just making the clicks to bring them to you and fulfill your needs. I mean, I think that like the wiping down the packages is actually a pretty good example that you cited. We learned pretty quickly that was not necessary, but yet we sort of, even as we learned that certain things were maybe less specific kind of situations were less of a risk than others, we continue to remain withdrawn and cautious and reliant on the delivery life to a degree that is just kind of striking, and that makes you wonder if it's actually now going to continue after the crisis.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that because I know we only have you for a limited period of time. Another thing that you're actually very well known for, and actually ties perfectly into this, is about schools. And you wrote about all of the children who, I mean, I wouldn't say we lost, but I think you might have titled it "The Lost Children of the Remote School Year," and I think that's a perfect example of where we have this confluence of science and worshiping science, which isn't actually scientific, becomes this cultural like shibboleth of people who are center left and upper middle class in particular, which leads to all sorts of like screwy public policy decisions. And, you see San Francisco being like, maybe we're going to go remote school even next year, which is the current teachers unions push as well. I would love to hear from you exactly the same. I wouldn't call it contrarian, but like I would say a much more reasoned approach to, listen, we stayed at home for a year and Amazon is now, a shit ton richer. And now we have had remote school for a year. What was the impact on that?
They're absolutely connected. I mean, there's a reason I've been kind of writing um, about both things at the same time. It's all linked, and I mean it's a tough thing I have to talk about. I have to be careful how I talk about it, but they're definitely um, something has happened in blue places this past year, where there was simply a vastly different assessment of of risk um, than in other parts of the country, and it was so so striking to me. And the second more recent piece I did two big pieces on the schools. One was based in Baltimore and focused more on the academic cost of the school closures, focused on a 11, 12-year-old boy in Baltimore who's really been struggling with remote learning. And then the other one more recently was about older kids and the sort of the emotional costs of the pandemic. And for that piece, I went down to New Mexico and Texas, and to tell the story of of a town on the New Mexico side that was really struggling, where the kids were really struggling because everything had been shut down. And then just to go across the border to the West Texas side, and where they had kept the schools open all the way up through high school, 5 days a week, to taking some measures, yes, such as contact tracing and masks in the hallways, but they were still playing football, and they were trying to maintain some kind of normalcy there, and not being denialist about it. They were just a different kind of assessment of the risk and sort of how to proceed, and it was just really striking to see it. And I think there's been, it certainly had something to do with, it was a classic case of polarization, of a negative polarization. But it's just been really where people in blue places in America saw Trump being derelict, and saw what they sort of thought in their mind was incredibly irresponsible behavior happening in sort of red places, and kind of polarized against all that into an extremely cautious stance, where 3-year-olds are wearing masks and joggers are double masked, and you are not leaving. You are ordering everything in if you can, and no way in heck are you can you open schools? That that would just be beyond the pale, risky, and it's been extraordinary thing to watch. And even as evidence has emerged on all these different fronts, including schools, that it can in fact be done. And then now we do end up with these stories sort of belatedly showing, the sort of Florida stories showing COVID outcomes, in places like Florida that have taken, a less lockdown approach, and being not as disastrous as the sort of caricature of them had initially made it out to be. And I do think there needs to be some reckoning in blue places about the approach that's been taken, and sort of how it came to that.
This is what's hard as we're closing, which is I'm not sure there is going to be a reckoning, in the sense that huge blessing that the vaccination process is proceeding the way it's proceeding. Sagar and I aren't vaccinated. We're really pumped to get vaccinated.
Yeah.
DC's in this weird position on this, but because of the fact that that's going to happen, I think people are going to memory hole the past year. They're going to memory hole the past year, and it's just going to be a baked in reality that we had in a time of increasing just winner take all inequality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, a whole generation of kids who are going to be really harmed by this. So what's tied up here? This isn't a policy book, so I don't want to ask you for solutions
Yeah.
to things because that almost misses it. But I'm kind of bummed out right now, to be entirely honest. like seriously, like you read the book, you listen to this conversation, and you really, my takeaway is actually to the specific set of problems you're diagnosing in America right now, there isn't a specific problem. You can you could split off Amazon Web Services from the book
Right.
division tomorrow, and literally, at least in terms of the really, really, really terrible things you're describing, from the opioid stuff to homelessness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that wouldn't change. So how should we just be thinking about these problems in a way that isn't going to lead us to, I would say, lackadaisical thinking or inevitabilism, to like circle it back to where we started?
So on the sort of policy front, I do think that, that breaking of the giants or somehow reining them in would have an actual substantive effect on this inequality, on this concentration. So that's still a fight worth having. But more generally, short of that, I think one goal of the book really was just to make people aware of just how extreme the inequality has become, and just to make it more part of their picture of the country, and to be to both to be more, in a way, to allow them to be more empathetic to people in the other places, the other half, outside of their own bubble. That's been a big part of my goal of my reporting these last few years, just to get people to see the other place and the people in it a little more clearly and a little more empathetically, but then also just to understand better why things are the way in the place where they live. Like, one specific example of this is that I'm always so confounded when the conversation about housing affordability in the winter cities is so just kind of locked in between the people arguing for building more supply versus rent control. That's like the whole intraliberal fight in all these cities like DC and New York and Boston and San Francisco and Seattle. And what it misses is that one reason things have gotten so tough in your city and so unaffordable and so crazy is that there's so much damn wealth and prosperity concentrated there. And meanwhile, just up the road in Baltimore, it's the complete opposite problem. And so we have people trying to afford $700,000, $800,000, $900,000 row houses in DC, while just up the road in Baltimore, we're knocking down houses by the hundreds, and houses that look the same or even possibly nicer than the DC counterparts, and just to get people to connect things and to see the bigger picture, and to be able to have a more coherent sense of how we've gotten to where we are, and to be able to sort of diagnose the problem. And the problem really is this incredible regional disparity that has made things off kilter for all of us, and it just shows up in different ways in different places. And so if I can just, if the book can just help people grasp that, and understand better sort of why things are the way they live, where they live, or why they are the way they are up the road, that in itself to me is a win.
Yeah. Alec, we appreciate you joining us so much. Seriously, it's an amazing read. It's fulfillment. It'll be available on our bookshop.org. You can also buy it on Amazon, I assume. Let's help him get his Amazon rankings up.
You assume.
I don't know. Maybe they'll ban it, right? That's what they're doing these days. You never have any idea. I've been reading your work for years, your piece, and I will put in the show notes, Revenge of the Forgotten Class. I read it the day after I believe that Trump was elected, and it really helped me process what was going on. So thank you. Keep up the great work, and we really appreciate you joining us.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the great questions.
Yeah.